Welcome to Brian Cave Leighton Paisner's program on influencers, risk and reward. Thank you for joining us. And we're going to make influencers out of some of you when you leave. We have a little surprise on your way out the door, so get prepared for that. I'd just love to have our panel introduce themselves. My name's Carol Osborne. I'm co-head of M&A and Corporate Finance at BCLP. But basically, I'm a retail lawyer. I work with retailers, brand owners, manufacturers, trying to help them extend their reach globally. And hopefully, I do that reasonably well. So, Melanie?
Hi, I'm Melanie Nardo. I look after the General Counsel for Luxury at Coty. You saw my boss speak before, so you know what Coty is by now, I think. But obviously, we have a mix in luxury of licensed brands and own brands. And we do actually also work with influencers. So this is something that is close to my heart, and I think I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion.
Hello, good morning. I am Nick Stewart, and I am the creator and founder of Gallivant. Gallivant is an artisan perfume maker. We're based in East London. And as an emerging artisan brand, we're obviously interested in how we use media and influencers to spread our story and get the word out.
Morning, everyone. My name's Jeremy Bark. I'm an associate director at Brian Cave Leighton Paisner. I'm part of our regulatory team, and therefore deal with a range of advertising issues, reputational issues, both on the advisory side, but also when things go wrong on the enforcement side, either with the ASA trading standards or the CMA. And I work closely with Carol. Only on the advisory side, I hasten to ask, because none of our clients would ever get into trouble.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joby Davis. I'm a commercial litigator, but I'm here in the context of someone who's done a lot of PR and brand reputation crisis management work over the years, particularly for celebrities and sports people.
Great. So let's get started with a little bit of vocabulary about who are these influencers and what exactly do they do. For me, I think, given my age, I like to distill it down to when I was back in school and there was the cool kids and there were the not cool kids. And you always wanted to be the cool kid, right? And you knew who the cool kids were. So it wasn't hard to figure out that you liked their clothes, or, by the way, those amazing sneakers just now, Golden Goose. Everybody was on their phones trying to figure out how they could buy a pair of fuchsia sparkly tennis shoes this morning. So essentially, when we're talking about influencers, we really are just talking about people with reach, right? And I think a fascinating statistic, there are, in fact, rankings of the top 20 influencers of 2018. You don't even get on the list unless you have 20 million followers. Now, nobody in high school in America had 20 million followers because the high schools aren't that big, but it's incredible with the digital reach that we have today. You know, how extensive the audience is that these individuals are reaching. So that's an influencer, and basically they're just communicating about themselves and their passions and their life in a way that their audiences find attractive, and therefore so do brands. So, but let's talk, Melanie, a little bit about, are these real people with 20 million views and subscribers?
Yeah, and I think that is interesting because really we talk about influencers in a way like one term, but actually, of course, it covers such a vast array of people, celebrities, you know, a kid with some aspirations. Like we know, I mean, there are people who want to be influencers. That's a new kind of career model, which wasn't when I was young. Then, of course, there's it's a new world, and I think it's evolving all the time. We have digital influencers, we have creations that are like people, but they're not people. A perfect example is, for example, Nunuri, one of the digital influencers, and I think that it covers such a vast spectrum, which then has advantages and disadvantages, because, of course, also with if you're working with digital influencers, you may not have the same issues as with a celebrity. You may not have the potential of something going wrong, like on Me Too, or, you know, vast array of other things that could happen. So I think it also offers the opportunity for brands to work with a safer type of influencer.
But Jeremy, I think, just shooting to you, isn't there something about trust, though, that when you realize that this person you've been following, this woman whose life that you admire or you like, or aspects of their life, and then you find out that that woman is actually a fictional creation of two guys who sit in a room, drinking beer and pizza, and goodness only knows what their life is like or why you should think it's interesting. But they've created this character. So is trust an issue?
I think trust is an issue, and there are probably a number of different facets to that. Firstly, for the brand itself, and quite clearly, you want to curate your own brand and make sure there is nothing that's going to get out there in the market that might affect that, but also for the consumer itself. And I think where that comes in is quite often with the regulators, and we'll get onto that a little bit more in a moment, but I think increasingly the regulators are trying to make sure that there is absolutely nothing at all that isn't transparent out there, which perhaps goes a little bit against marketing and some of the things in terms of puffery. But I think there's quite an interesting stat from the CMA in its recent guidance that it's issued. They anticipate that at least 6% of those that make purchasing decisions, before they do so, they will have reference to a vlog or a blog. And therefore, I think increasingly, that's why this trust issue is coming into play. If people are trying to rely upon some of this content, then the view is that that should actually be accurate.
When we think about the presentation this morning from Alibaba, that if you imagine 6% of their consumers are looking at a blog or a vlog before they're taking a purchasing decision, that's a huge amount of reliance, or at least investigation through these influencers into whether or not you want to buy a particular product. So, Melanie, we're gonna start with you on some of the benefits to a brand. Why would you engage with influencers at all?
I think, again, I think it's, of course, you have sort of the old world and you have more traditional media, but at the end, this is, in addition, one way of talking to your consumer, and increasingly so, probably a quicker and with more direct access to your consumer. And I think that is required if you want to stay close. And it probably also depends a little bit on the brand, and likely more so on some of the younger brands, more of the edgy brands which have more social media relevance. So I think it is actually hard to not do anything with influencers. It would be like saying we're ignoring one part of the equation of how you communicate to your consumer. I also think that it's something which can be exciting as well, also for your for the recipients, because again, as this is something that's evolving, when you look at some of the digital piece, if you look at a lot of the press coverage as well in recent times, not only on how it's changing, but also even on the kind of legal landscape, it's something that makes news. So I think automatically you would want to be part of that in a, within a regulated framework. And I think particularly with younger consumers, that's what they want to see. And actually I think it's also, they understand much better that this is authentic. They understand how it works. They understand that people are getting paid for this. It's part of a bigger way of dealing with media. So I think, for most brands, I think it can have a benefit.
So we heard from Golden Goose this morning how important emotion is, how important storytelling is. And to me, it just seems like you're handing over that emotional connection opportunity and the content creation, really, to an influencer, to someone else who are going to tell the story in their own way, and that might not be consistent with the story that your brand or brands want to tell.
And I think you're right, and that's why you need lawyers involved, because I think there needs to be a framework, of course, exactly for that reason, so that you can keep some control of how things go. You can also minimize some of the risks if you might have an influencer that gets associated with something the brand doesn't want to be associated with. So I think that's the downside. Of course, in a way which is digital and very public, it can easily get out of control. So I think you're right that there are risks there. And also, actually, in some cases, influencers are small startup or individuals who grow very, very quickly, who may not have a law department with lawyers who can advise them well. So some of that responsibility also falls onto the brand, or sort of on the company who's engaging them, to help them, to help guide them where they may end in trouble, both for themselves but also for the brand.
So Joby, how much control can we really have here? Do they have to be themselves and independent, or can brands intervene?
Well, I mean, the businesses will know better, but I think that this balance between something that is fluid and quite instinctive and is the personality of the influencer coming through, because that's what you want to engage as a brand, and also the kind of traditional model where there might be a long-term campaign that's put in place, worked out in a very controlled environment. That is the tension now as to what's happening. The influencers tend to move much more quickly. They may come into vogue and have a big set of followers, and then 6 months later they may not. So I think that when you're engaging influencers, you are looking both to control them, but also to allow them to have that flexibility to be themselves, because that's what you've engaged. And I think from a legal point of view, the way it's changing is the kind of due diligence that companies can do on these influencers is much less, because they may not be known. They may arrive in the scene very quickly, build up a following, and then the brand may decide that they want to contract with that person on the way up, not knowing a huge amount about them. I mean, traditionally you'd use celebrities where you knew a lot about. So you may be thinking about how long this contract's going to be, how you're going to exit from it. Is probably as important now to brands when they're thinking of contracting them as engaging with them, the terms on which you're going to engage, but also the terms to pull out if they lose following, if they start to be a damage to the brand. All those kind of things are much more important factors, I think, now than they ever were.
So just out of interest, how many people in the audience are using influencers as part of your social and general marketing strategy, just on a show of hands? Yeah, so this is clearly an important component of brand reach, brand extension for everyone. All right, Nick, you're our holdout for traditional media, traditional values. What are some of the challenges, and why are you reluctant to dip your toe in the water?
I think, like a lot of founders, a lot of creators, I'm overwhelmed actually by influencers. I'm relieved not to have a phone with a signal at the moment, because by now I would have had 3 influencers asking me to send my full collection to them for nothing, so they can post a picture on Instagram. So I think my experience has been that, of course, we're often seduced by the new. We love the excitement of digital media and influencers on Instagram. But I'm going to sound a note for legacy media. My experience with my brand, Galavant, has been that when we get coverage on the BBC, on the Times, the Sunday Times, that's when it has a real lasting impact in terms of sales and awareness on my brand. So I almost think when I speak to younger people and they say to me, their marketeers, their ideas are all about which social media people we're engaged with, I always like to remind them that the editors, the beauty directors, are often the real influencers in the world, the product world that I'm operating in. And I think there's a question mark for me about quality. So, I grew up in the perfume world where you'd speak to editors and they've seen every launch. They really do know a lot about perfume and perfume making. They know a lot of the materials, for example. And I find the contrast with the younger people, younger in terms of profile, they literally just want to take a picture very quickly. That's all they want. They don't want to talk about anything to do with the perfume, and then they just want to leave to go to the next appointment. And I'm not convinced that for a brand like mine, that quality is present on some of these influencers' So for me, I'm really looking for quality. I'm looking for people that have a genuine passion for what we're doing. And I think my customers are also influencers. I know that a lot of my business is word of mouth. That's what I would dream of in a perfume brand. And a lot of my customers don't have following of 1 million or 2 million, but they're telling their friends, they're telling their colleagues, and that spreads genuine influence around perfume.
So story is very important to your brand.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to ask our lawyers at the end of the table, can you control story when you're dealing with influencers?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'm almost a little hesitant about saying we're really a founder-driven brand, but we are. Galavant is a founder-driven brand. It's my ideas translated into perfumes. So, of course, an element of control over the storytelling is important. An element of control over the messaging is important. And I'm loath sometimes to work with these influencers who really just limit it to a photograph on a feed, because actually it doesn't tell you anything about the perfume. I mean, first of all, you can't smell it. You're making very quick decisions based on the aesthetics, which are important, but really the most important star of the show for me is the juice, the materials, the beautiful materials we make our perfumes with. And I'm not convinced, personally, today, that a lot of the influencers of social media are the best carriers of that story. Yeah. They're just not interested, actually. It's too detailed for them.
It's like asking your kids to read a book. Good, yeah. So Joby, again, back to control. Editorial control. That's a big issue, isn't it?
It's a big issue. I think if answering just from a legal standpoint, the more editorial control you are, the more you move into a kind of regulated environment in terms of the Advertising Standard Agency having an ability to sanction you for what these influencers may say on behalf of your brand. You can seek to control in contracts you may have with influencers. I think that's a way that it's moving in terms of governing what they can say, how they say it, how they post, all that kind of control. And I think the brands are starting to impose on the influencers. I mean, a lot of that then comes back to what happens in that kind of fluid, natural transaction, which is this new environment of influencer promoting brands, is if they go off message again. The control you can also impose into contracts at that stage, the right to terminate, the right to remove tweets or photos that they may have done. So all of that, lawyers are now moving in to protect companies as far as they can. But you are just in a much more fluid, less traditional environment for promoting, and that just comes with risk, I think.
I think, as Joby was saying, in terms of the ASA, there are two key elements really before they will now say that they have control over the content. So one is clearly payment, whether that's monetary or you're just giving them the product, but the second is control. So you end up with a slight dichotomy. The more control that you start to exercise over your social influencer, particularly if you start to control their content, then the more likely it is that the ASA will actually intervene and regulate. And there was a fairly recent case where there was control over some of the content, and it was a requirement on the social influencer to properly tag their Instagram feeds with hashtag advert, and they forgot. And notwithstanding that, a complaint was made, it was upheld against them. There was very little that I think the brand could have done in those circumstances. What more could really they have done? They'd got a contract, they'd set out their requirements, and the social influencer simply forgot. Probably goes to your point in terms of trust of there. I think the other issue as well is we're all talking here really about where you've got a relationship with a social influencer, and probably one of the things that Joby's seen, and certainly we've seen as a firm, where it's harder, is if you have a social influencer with whom you have no relationship, but they're talking about your brand. And so it's not an advertorial content as such, it's pure sort of editorial of their opinion. And again, that can be incredibly difficult for a number of reasons to control, and whether you want to wade into some form of social media storm, etc., can be an incredibly difficult judgment call.
Yeah, and I think that's a big area. I mean, sometimes it's very obvious to see for brands, they've engaged, they've identified an influencer, whether it's a celebrity or someone who's who has a large social media following, and they have sought that person out, and they may enter into a contract, and that contract may be for single post, it may be for single campaign, it may be long term. And that kind of direct engagement, other kind of things may well be that items that you have are being gifted out to people who are influencers. You have no requirement on that individual to promote your product. You don't know what they're going to do, but you're giving them an item, and they may well post. And at that point, again, the regulators are moving into that space as well to control your responsibilities as brands as to what the influencer has to say. If they post a picture with your brand, you've never spoken to them, you've never said, if you post this picture, post it here or there, you've just given them an item. And even then, there are responsibilities on the brand to make clear to the consumer or the people who are seeing those posts that this was a gifted item, and that that person has received that item effectively as payment to promote the product. So it's a very, very regulated area now, and an area where the regulators are more and more interested in exerting their control.
And I think one of the challenges there is some of those regulators are not necessarily as sophisticated as you might like them to be in terms of understanding some of the concepts and perhaps how social media works. And on the flip side, to be fair to the regulator, particularly if you're dealing with the ASA and its codes of practice, it will say the codes are clear and we apply these codes to all advertisers equally. And therefore, that's one of its challenges in the sense that certainly the ASA, its overriding principle above all things, you won't find this anywhere, but in dealing with it, is it wants things to be absolutely clear, transparent, and give as simple a message as clearly as you can. Well, when you're trying to curate a luxury brand and you're talking about creating an image or a fantasy, immediately there's a little bit of a tension there. When you then start to get into the CMA, which is looking at enforcement issues, and it's regulating this area between ASA doesn't cover it, therefore it's not quite advertising, but it's more sponsorship, and it's looking at its more formal powers under the BPRs or the CPRs. Again, I'm not entirely sure the extent to which it fully covers the social influencers, notwithstanding that they say it does. And in the recent case, the CMA wasn't talking about formal undertakings, which is one of its powers. It said that it got formal, quotes, commitments from those social influencers. So I think it's an area where the regulators themselves, notwithstanding their recent guidance, but if you read that, some of it is slightly flaky, they themselves are trying to get to grips with the area. And it's a bit of a voyage and a bit of a journey for them too.
Could I just add, I think there's, on the part of, I speak to my customers a lot, and I think on the part of customers, there's a massive cynicism about what's paid for and what's not. So a few months ago, I was featured on a very big US blog, and my US retailers rang me to reorder the product, which was obviously wonderful. But a few of them asked me, oh, how much did you pay the blogger? And I explained I hadn't actually had any contact at all with the blogger. The blogger had found my products on sale in Italy. She'd bought them herself. She'd taken them home to America. She'd loved the fragrances, and she'd written at length about them, and it had a great impact. But I have never, ever had any contact with her, much less ever paid her for anything. But my retailers were convinced that I had some commercial agreement with her, that it was just not flagged up anywhere. So I think even when you're not doing it, the assumption on the part of retailers and certainly customers is that we're all in this game together, and it's a little bit of a con, actually. They're cynical, and I think rightly so about it.
And I think it also highlights, actually, very interestingly, that sometimes you are really not in control of your brand. And that I think that is just also something that we need to understand and accept, that the way the world is developing, the way digital is developing, that there is less control that you're able to have on brands versus 10 years ago. And I think that's interesting, particularly for companies like Coty, where you have licensing arrangements as well, because of course that there is another layer and another party where you have obligations as well. So I think it's something where also can be much more risky than a few years ago.
Well, I'm sure if the marketing department came and saw the legal team at any of your brands and said, we're just going to let people write whatever they want. I mean, the legal team would say, are you out of your mind? You can't do that. But in fact, that is the world in which you can live inadvertently simply by having a brand that somebody is attracted to and likes and decides that they want to claim as part of their lifestyle and their image. So, you know, this is the Luxury Law Summit. So let's just spend a minute on luxury and whether influencers who, by definition, have a mass reach, right? They are in that environment of anyone. I mean, the only thing that is holding someone back is perhaps the price point, although perhaps not even that. So is it sympathetic with being a luxury brand to use an influencer? Melanie, what do you think? Obviously, yes.
I think it can be. I think it can be. I think that you need to be very, very careful who you work with. And I think, to Joby's point, actually also you need to be flexible also to be able to get out of those arrangements exactly to that point, because what could be seem very luxurious in the right direction can change very quickly. So I think it's even more important for luxury that you're able to change course if you have to, and part ways with certain influencers where you feel it's not working. So I think that I think it can work really well for some brands. I'm not saying it works for all brands, but I do think it's something that probably has to be thrown into the equation, and it's part of an overall media mix. But I think that one needs to be very, very careful, and in luxury probably even more so, because everything is, of course, digital and can move very fast, and you can create a lot of value, but you can also destroy a lot of value very quickly.
And are you getting pressure from the licensors to engage with this type of marketing and social? Are they saying, as part of your obligations, to grow the brand on their behalf effectively under the license arrangements, that this is part of the mechanisms that they want you to use?
I think, again, it depends. I think for sure it is now pretty standard that is part of the conversation, and we're working with our brands in that way. So it's not always going to be like this, and it will not be for all brands, but for sure I think it is now clearly part of the equation, and it's part of the discussion, and part of our overall, when you're looking at overall media, that is one way of influencing your communication to consumers, for sure. I think that's what's changed, yeah.
It's interesting when you look at some of the mega luxury brands, and I put Chanel on the slide, that, they are influencers, all by themselves just because of the sheer power of their brand, but they have been, very focused on controlling the story, not necessarily letting, influencers engage in quite the same way, running their own videos, creating their own fiction and fantasy world that is aspirational and that they want people to be attracted to. And so, Nick, would that feel more luxury to you than?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of contradiction at the heart of some of this, that it is quite broad, naturally, social media. I can only really speak about perfume, but perfume is a particular little world on its own. Making perfume is complex and beautiful. So for me, I think what's important is to have the quality in terms of the messaging as part of my mix. And I'll be very honest and say some of the big people that have approached me, and I know really they just want to do a quick picture with a bottle on a flat lay, I don't really believe it cuts through with my customers. I think there's a real problem about quality and consistency across this whole emerging social world, which in some ways is why, for luxury brands, the legacy media partners are in some ways safer to deal with still. There are many quality checks in their processes as publishing houses that many of these Instagram or YouTube stars simply don't know about. They don't have. They don't really realize. Yeah.
Do you think there's an element in this at all where some of the brands perhaps have to try and educate some of the social influencers in terms of this is what we require from you if we're going to use you. And I think particularly when they're might be best described as being fledgling, quite clearly they're not necessarily going to have those skills, and therefore, as you would have in any other form of marketing campaign, have a strategy that deals with, okay, what support do these partners actually need?
Yeah, because a lot of them, you know, the more emerging fledgling people, their technical knowledge of perfumery is so lacking that the conversation is completely different, and you even have to begin of saying how you smell a little and how you'd apply a fragrance, which is not a conversation I would have had with the Vogue beauty director. Yeah.
Well, we're getting a lot of scrutiny. You know, the CMA, Competition Markets Authority, has been in the press quite a bit this year already on trying to clamp down on some of this new novel type of advertising. I mean, just the list of regulators involved in terms of individual trading standards authorities and the CMA and the ASA. So no question we're heading towards a regulatory focus, I think, but they don't have that many resources. How much time are they spending on social?
So I think the challenge is trading standards historically, when I first started many, many moons ago, doing my job, each local authority has a trading standards department, which is where, and each one of those will have trading standards officers. They used to be very well resourced, and each local authority would bring a number of prosecutions each year in a variety of different spheres. I think one of the effects that we've seen markedly with austerity is that local authority budgets have been slashed. So they probably have less lawyers. A lot of them share lawyers across maybe 3, 4, 5, even 6 different local authority areas. But actually within some of these technical departments, trading standards being one of them, there have been huge cutbacks. And so their ability to actually regulate in the way that they historically would have done has been somewhat curtailed. And therefore I think that's why the CMA is increasingly stepping into that void, and also the ASA. So I think for most brands, the regulator that they are most likely to come into contact with will be the ASA. It has codes, it's supposed to be self-regulating, their investigation process is very short. Some might say it's a little bit too superficial given the damage they could do to the brand if they uphold a decision. But in essence, from start of an investigation to the ASA reaching an initial decision can be as little as a month. And so they are definitely the regulator that's filling that breach.
And I'm just going to remind you that, I mean, we're here in the UK, but the US has been focused on this for a very long time, and the Federal Trade Commission takes it very seriously. I mean, these fines are non-trivial, even if you have 20 million followers. I think having to pay 40 grand if they think you've done it wrong, that's a problem. And saying thanks, I mean, I think hashtag thanks or hashtag thank you was the quick and dirty way, going back to the sophistication of these influencers. That is definitely not enough under the FTC's guidelines. So I think we started off by sort of saying, you know, the kids are not confused, right? So we have all of this regulation, and there's even different regulators becoming more interested. But let's, Joby, potentially responsible parties in terms of whose job is it to make sure these things are done properly?
Well, it will be the job of both the influencer and the brand. I mean, coming back to the authorities, if the authorities pursue or enforce as a result of a campaign that they think an influencer has run that is not acceptable, they won't just go after the influencer, the brand will come in. And I think that's important to know. Even if your contract has said you must do this, you must announce on any post that you make that you are being paid or that this is commercial content. If the influencer doesn't, the regulatory authorities will come after them. And there was one thing I was just going to add before, but then I'll come back, and that when we're thinking regulation as well, you often need to, for as long as we remain there, European regulations as well. For example, if we're discussing food or health issues are being promoted, again, they may need to be governed by regulations that are imposed by the European Commission on being able to substantiate statements about health and food, nutrition value. So it's quite wide in terms of the areas that you can move in depending on your product. But I think the brand, even if the brand has a contract with the influencer that is a responsible contract that sets out the need for that influencer to act responsibly, to be transparent on all their posts, that they are being paid, or that this is gifted, or that this is advertising content. The brand itself still needs to be monitoring what those influencers are doing and being prepared to step in to enforce its rights under the contract if that influencer doesn't act in accordance with what's been agreed. Otherwise, it will be the brand who is normally on the end of the hook for the fine, because a lot of these influencers can't afford to pay the fines that are being imposed anyway.
I think there are probably another couple of important points in terms of that. First and foremost, if you were doing a sort of multi-channel media campaign where you were spending a lot of money, and we advise a number of clients in relation to that, what you will quite often do is have alternative wording or alternative adverts that you produce as part of that strategy. So if the ASA ends up coming up and investigating and upholding a decision, or you decide that actually you want to shut down that investigation by giving an undertaking that you won't use the offending phrase, you've immediately got other content that you can replace that with. And I'm not sure how sophisticated in the context of social influence that every brand is in terms of having that same approach. I think the other thing that's important as well, if you're talking in the UK about formal enforcement action, so it'll typically be under consumer protection legislation, then there are two sides of the same coin that are relevant. Quite often you'll have some form of due diligence defence, and therefore the more control you're exercising, the more you can document that, the more you can say it wasn't us, Gov. Yes, we understand that you've still got to go and speak to the social influencer, but actually vis-a-vis us, what more could we have done? Or secondly, even if there isn't necessarily some form of due diligence defence, there are two tests that a regulator has to undertake before they can prosecute. One is the evidential test. Well, hopefully they're not even speaking to you unless they're satisfied as to that. But secondly, the public interest test. So if you've actually exercised lots of control and undertaken lots of due diligence, I struggle really to see how it could be in the public interest to then bring some form of formal enforcement action. So again, probably worth thinking about a little bit.
So Melanie, who's responsible for policing your influencer? Is it you and your team, or is it the marketing team?
It's a combination, actually. So, of course, we'd make sure when we're working with an influencer that we educate them, because I think that is also the responsibility often that they may simply not be aware of what needs to be done to be compliant. And then in the same way, the marketing team needs to understand, and in some cases, you know, their whole influencer teams, they need to understand how influencers need to operate, so that they can also see their day-to-day. And of course, you know, there's an oversight from the law department. But I think that's the reality of how you need to operate to ensure that you don't end up in any issues.
Okay, we're going to end on a high note then. So, Joby, what do you do when it does go horribly wrong? Because you know, except for the fantasy ones or the CGI created influencers where nothing can go horribly wrong, hopefully, because they're just a fiction. What do you do?
Well, I think look at it from two areas. First is what you have provided for contractually when you've entered into a commercial arrangement with these influencers, and there you are giving rights to, effectively, as we were talking about earlier, terminate the contract. So you might have morality clauses, which have been around for many, many years, but these give you the right to terminate any contract if the behavior of the celebrity or the influencer doesn't meet the requirements or the standards that the brand sets itself. Other clauses you may want is the lawyers are now thinking of the kind of control you want. You may want the ability to, if you want to distance yourself from that influencer, to go in and require them to delete all images or posts that may connect with your brand. So you're just almost wiping a history of your connection with that brand. Other things you may want to do is be able to reduce payments that you may be making to these people if their value to you is not as much. And these negotiating on the contracts, at the moment, I think with a lot of the influencers, unless they're celebrities, the brand holds a lot of the power in terms of those negotiating. But I think as we move forward and influencers themselves are becoming more and more powerful and using more lawyers and maybe advertising agencies, you'll find that even negotiating things like morality clauses will move a long way, so it's much harder for the brand to control. But so that's the kind of contractual provisions. You just need to be thinking at the time you enter into a contract, what's going to happen if it goes wrong, and what's going to happen if I want to get out of this contract. But I think then, as has been the way throughout, you also need to have PR campaigns. I think what's coming across is that influencers, on the whole, they have a lot of benefit in terms of the targeting and the fluidity and the way that they can hit markets that perhaps were not available to the brands to hit before, who would go through the traditional. But that comes with its own risk. If these people, and a lot of them, it's much harder to due diligence the individuals before you make, so everything about the arrangement is a bit more risky. So you need to have a PR strategy, I think, at the same time you're going in. You need to be thinking what's going to happen. And those PR strategies are who's going to comment from the brand, how quickly you decide whether you are going to distance yourself from the celebrity or this individual, whether you are going to come out immediately and terminate that arrangement, or whether you're going to stick in with that celebrity for some time. And I think that and if you look at the kind of the big companies, corporates, Nike, for example, that was connected with Tiger Woods and stuff like that, and you've seen the extramarital stuff damaging his image, and then you saw drink driving. You see how, and then other celebrities, say, who've been with these sports companies, you see how the brands have acted. But I think consistent message and being able to move with PR agents into damage limitation very quickly is absolutely essential when you are dealing in this area.
Great. We have a takeaway slide that is going to be distributed as part of the wrap-up from the event today. And we've actually run out of time. So I'm just going to say Nick has put together some little gift packages of his perfume. He does not want you to post an Instagram. He does not want you to hashtag anything. He wants you to tell a friend. Yeah, he didn't pay any of you, but he does want you to tell a friend. And Melanie, thank you so much, and Nick, and Jeremy, and Joby, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.